Hi, folks. Welcome to our next philosopher, Dostoevsky, and his work, The Brothers Karamazov. Dostoevsky had a long literary career with many different novels and other works. And in The Brothers Karamazov, he draws on all of them. There's a way in which this really is the crowning achievement of his career. And so many of the characters. So the main character, Theodore, is the father, and he has several different sons through several different complicated and difficult marriages. Dimitri, Ivan, Alyosha, and Smerdyakov. And each of these characters gets a lot of description and it has their own existential position. So Dostoevsky packs so many different ideas into this novel that he's taking from many of his other works. He ended up dying. Dostoevsky died very soon after finishing this work. So he sort of barely got it out. It was the culmination of his entire life's work, and then he could die happily afterward. But he did not have a happy life. He had an incredibly complicated life. He was a famous literary figure early on, but he had many ups and downs. He was accused of treason at one point, and was set to be executed, brought right before a firing squad before they decided not to shoot him. He was sent to Siberia for several years before he then had a comeback and came back into famous literary prominence by writing this work. Like many long novels at this time, this work was serialized and came out in pieces, just like Charles Dickens's works in England. And so the public was waiting on it. This was like the Game of Thrones of its day, to see what was going to happen next in this wild story of the Karamazov family. Now, just like the subtlety of Kierkegaard's work, even though Kierkegaard's work was only a couple hundred pages, and this is 800 to 1,000 pages, you have to pay attention. It is just as subtle and interesting from the very beginning. Like the father, the patriarch of this work is named Theodore. And I think it's no coincidence that Dostoevsky does not use a pseudonym. He puts Theodore, his own name, in there. There are ways in which each of these characters represents parts of Dostoevsky, the author. And he is like the father of all of them, metaphorically speaking, just like Theodore is the fictional father of all of them. He also dedicates this to his wife. So just like the father, Theodore, in the Fyodor Karamazov, Dostoevsky had several difficult marriages, but he dedicates this to his second wife, Anna. This is really significant. And I will come back later, once you understand the text more, to talk about why I read this in a deeply personal way. Just like I think Kierkegaard's work is a deeply personal work, even though he's talking about the story of Abraham and Isaac. Something very similar and interesting is going on here with the Dostoevsky. And of course, you can't miss the epigraph here either. This is a passage from the Bible. So just like Kierkegaard's epigraph was a reference, an allusion to Grimm's fairy tales, here we get an allusion to the New Testament, the saying of Jesus, verily, verily, I say unto you, except a weed of corn falls onto the ground and die, it abideth alone. But if it die, it bringeth forth much fruit. This, people think this, or often say this passage is very clear. I think it's not quite so clear. It's a bit perplexing. Like, what does death have to do with bringing forth the fruit? So the standard interpretation of this is to see this as a reference to Jesus's crucifixion. Like Jesus is foretelling that his own death is going to bring all of these benefits. Like it's through his death that then humanity can be saved. So I want you to think about that interpretation and what else Dostoevsky does with this passage. Why is this passage actually encapsulate some of the key central philosophical ideas for Dostoevsky? Once you start to understand them, we'll come back and try to unpack what this epigraph was actually foreshadowing for us. In this video, I want to talk about some of the main characters so you get a sense of who they are. Let's start with Fyodor, the father. The number one thing to understand about him is to see how the novel portrays him in complicated and conflicting ways. So he is a living contradiction. At one point, the novel describes him as worthless and depraved. He's always making ridiculous decisions. He's acting ridiculously. At the same time, he's supposed to be clever and shrewd, and it seems like it's impossible to be both of those things. So this was a deeply patriarchal and classist society in Russia in its day. So there was the class of aristocrats, the moneyed land-owning folks, and then there was the serfs and the working class people and the farmers. And Fyodor has money. He's one of the folks who has servants, who has live-in servants with him. So he's in the upper class, but he's he's like at the lower end of the upper class, and he's sort of this unstable or self-doubting social status. He has he has a conflicted opinion even of his own self and his own worth. But the one way in which he actually keeps from becoming destitute, the novel says he's actually clever. He's good with his money, and even though he doesn't have a lot of it, he's smart with it, and that's how he can stay afloat and maintain his manor and his estates and whatnot. Another way in which he's portrayed as being conflicted, like at being released from his marriage, he rejoices but weeps at the exact same time. This is like a living contradiction, how he could do both those things. Besides his contradictory nature, sort of related to this, the number one thing about him is his sensuality and his sort of passionate nature is what the novel describes. I look forward to foreshadow the film for you a little bit. Here's one of the lines of dialogue that he says in the movie. I believe only in what I can touch, feel, hear, smell, or taste. So this is sort of like Kierkegaard's lower immediacy, the aesthetic, living completely his sensual nature. He is passionate. He is sort of carnivorous and enjoys food and wine. And I think the important thing to realize is this description of him, physically speaking, actually Dostoevsky is telling us that this is a description of his spiritual or his existential nature as well. We see this like on page 23, we have this line about how he's very bloated. But then the telling part, I think, is this. This is Dostoevsky, or the narrator, saying, his physiognomy by that time presented something that testified acutely to the characteristics of his whole life. So this is like his physical appearance and his demeanor are actually a reflection of his entire spiritual life as well. I think that just adds a whole nother level of depth to this, even though it is on the surface, I think, wonderful description as well. Like his repulsively sensual appearance. You see, this is not a man in a great existential state, is what we can infer from these two lines. That he is repulsive. He has a carnivorous mouth. And we're told to read this as a description of his soul as well. So there's something slightly repulsive or deeply problematic about his spiritual state. So besides being such a sensualist, the other interesting thing is that he doesn't take himself completely seriously. Like in that quote that we just saw, he makes fun of himself so that nobody else can make fun of him first, as if he's not going to let other people get one up him or look down on him. As long as he looks down on his own self just as fast or first, then he takes something away from their criticisms. The other thing to think about is the dissolution of his marriages. So all of his wives are deceased at this point. So he is living alone, and he didn't have any happiness in those marriages. So the marriages were, gave him an aspect to his life. They gave him children, but even those children bring him no happiness, and he would not be described as a good father in any way. Now, let's turn to his first child, Dimitri. So there's ways in which all of the children of Theodore reflect aspects of him. So we can understand some of these descriptions of Dimitri as being passionate and wild and disorderly. This is a lot like Theodore. There's ways in which Dimitri is reflected in Theodore, and the tension, the enmity the two have for each other is partly a reflection how they see the similarities in each other. And another thing to pay attention to is how characters describe each other. So this is Theodore describing Dimitri. He simply concluded that the young man was frivolous, wild, passionate, impatient. It's funny that he sees these faults, which he is unwilling to forgive in Dimitri. In part, this is projection of Theodore's and him not willing to face up to the fact that he deserves some of the same criticisms. Because look at this description. Theodore, though he led a wild, drunken, and debauched life, still never stopped investing his capital. So there's ways in which they're both wild, drunken, and debauched, living lives of debauchery. So there's ways in which the son and the father are very similar, and that partly explains the deep tensions and dislike that they have for each other. Dimitri is also described in conflicting ways. So this is a way in which he's similar to Theodore too. In parts, so I give you some examples from some of the sections that are not in your reading, but Dimitri is a young man, so he was an officer in the military. But even though he was a young man, it says immediately he appeared much older, which is sort of a tension or a contradiction. Or it says also, he has great physical strength, but also he appears sickly. He's determined but vague. So there's all of these all of these aspects of him that are swirling around in a completely unsettled way. That's how I think we're supposed to understand the character of Dimitri. And I think that's also what explains some of the hatred they have for each other. It's partly an aspect of self-hatred, or to put it in more religious terms, it's an aspect of shame that they are trying to come to grips with the human condition, the difficulties, unsuccessfully coming to grips with it. So one last thing about Dimitri that I think is important is Dostoevsky tells us to read the son as a reflection of the father, who was like him and yet in other ways slightly different. So in another passage that's not included in your reading, I think this is a really deep observation by one of the characters named Rakitin, who's a friend of Alyosha's. Rakitin says this, so Mitenka, this is Dimitri. One thing you have to come to grips with is in this novel, many different names are used to refer to the same people. And Russia uses lots of diminutives. So besides just Dimitri, Mitenka is like a familiar diminutive version of Dimitri. So Rakitin says, I'll tell you one thing. Granted, Dimitri's an honest man. I mean, he's stupid but honest. He's a sensualist. That is his definition and his whole inner essence. It's his father who gave him his base sensuality. So I think in Dostoevsky's mindset, the way he's set up the philosophy, the structure of the piece, each of the children represents aspects of Theodore expressed in different ways. And they each try to come up and they try to wrestle with their own version of the human condition, just like the father does. And we can see which ones are going to be successful and which ones are going to be unsuccessful. And that, in a sense, tells us Dostoevsky's judgment on each of these characters. So Dimitri, again, is a lot like Theodore. They're both deeply sensualist. He exactly gets it from his father. This is critical. But of course, where does the rest of him come from? We should think about the descriptions of the mothers of each of the children is also really important. And I think Dostoevsky really presents us with each child as a combination of features of both parents. And then we're going to sort of see how their fates play out and see how each of them grapples with the version of the human condition they're stuck with. So from Theodore, Dimitri gets his passionate nature, his sensual nature, but his mother is described as being aristocratic and deeply independent and noble. So what that means is basically Dimitri has a kind of moral compass, a code of honor that he gets from his mother, and that is sort of lacking in Theodore. Theodore doesn't have this aspect of himself. He can't take himself seriously. He doesn't have honor in that way. But Dimitri does, and that's why even though Dimitri is a lot like Theodore, he has to grapple with the human condition in a very different way than Theodore. He is deeply aware of that he is honorable, or he has this sense of honor, and yet he fails to live up to it because he is a depraved individual. So that means Dimitri has a deep shame. He has a self-awareness of his own failure in a way in which Theodore just flees or hides from. Dimitri continually describes himself as an insect, and that's him referring to this base earthly aspect of his own being. We see this even highlights the kind of tension and contradiction that Theodore lives. Well, Dimitri really explicitly leaves this tension, and that is what leads to his constant feelings of shame. And then we're going to see the kind of religious and existential descriptions of this. So, for example, he says, now I'm sorry and loathe myself for my beastly rage. He gets this beastly aspect to himself from his father, but because of his mother's sense of honor, he hates himself for it. And he doesn't see himself as worthy of having the good things that come to him in his life. Okay. Now, what about the other children? So Dimitri is an only child from Theodore's first marriage. His second marriage leaves him with two sons, Ivan and Alyosha. And there's again ways in which these two children both manifest their father and their mother, features of them. But in a sort of beautiful way, they do it in diametrically opposed forms. So Ivan is the arch atheist. He's described as the philosopher of the peace. And sort of as a philosopher myself, I have to say that it's with a bit of a trepidation that I see many aspects of myself and philosophy reflected in Ivan. And Alyosha is the arch religious devotee. So, for example, at one point in the film, you'll see, Theodore is making fun of this whole thing. Theodore can't even take religion seriously enough. He's such a buffoon. But he says, is there a God? Is there immortality? And Ivan yells no, and Alyosha yells yes. So we see they are presented as like yin and yang, as polar opposites, sort of in tension with each other, but still drawn to each other because they are like two sides of the same coin. They are connected, both being the products of their father and mother. So Ivan, he feels a lot of shame in his life too. He's sort of a gloomy, withdrawn character. He's melancholic in a sense, but he also has a deep sense of pride and honor that he gets from his mother and her religiosity. He's the one who pursues education in a sense to prove himself in the world. But he's also a deeply rationalist and in a detached figure. He's not invested in the same way in which Alyosha is. So his column, for example, as a writer, is called The Eyewitness. So it's like it refers to him as the observer. The eyewitness is the person who observes the events, not the person who is involved in the events. Alyosha, and you have to realize the book often calls him Alexei. So this is another way. These are just two names used interchangeably for the same person. Alyosha is, again, more of a familiar diminutive version of the name. He is really a bit of the angelic character in the work. He is continually a messenger between the other characters, and he has this kind of this Christ-like love for everybody, and is a mediator between so many people. At the same time, so just like the yin and yang of Ivan, he is uneducated. He's the youngest and never went away to get educated. He went into the monastery and pursues his intellectual endeavors in a purely spiritual way through his religious devotion. Now, these kind of characters who are portrayed as angelic at the beginning of a work, oftentimes that could lead to one-dimensional characters. So I think it's a testament to Dostoevsky's vision that he finds a way to actually not make Alyosha one-dimensional, and is one of the most interesting characters in the piece. So from these two parents, I think Alyosha and Ivan both get interesting things. One of the things that really ties them together is they have a deep sort of love for others and love for humanity. But what you have to keep track of is the way in which their love is different. One is a kind of detached, universal love, whereas the other is a very involved, temporal or particular love. So hopefully this reminds you, for example, in Kierkegaard, when I talked about very different ethical sorts of commitments, the particular duties you have to the individuals around you, that has what I portrayed as the sort of Christian involved aspect, versus the universal Greek philosophical aspect of love for all of humanity in a more objective way. That's the way it manifests with Ivan. What we have to see then is how the fates of these characters work out and what kind of actions they engage in. Okay, so I will leave Smirjikov for later discussion because he doesn't have a very prominent role yet. But this is a quick introduction to Theodore and Dimitri, Ivan, and Alyosha. Okay, thanks.